Sign this lease release form right now, Martin, or your security keycard gets deactivated in 5 seconds. Brandon sneered, tossing a silver fountain pen across his polished mahogany executive desk. I did not reach for the pen. I calmly looked down at the fraudulent commercial eviction notice he had drafted, then raised my eyes to meet his furious glare. I reached into my coat pocket, unclipped my brass master key ring, and placed it quietly on the glass tabletop next to my corporate identity badge. I won't sign an illegal document, Brandon, and you don't need to deactivate my card. I'll walk out myself. Brandon let out a harsh, arrogant laugh as two private security guards stepped up behind my chair. You're done here, old man. You have 5 minutes to clear your personal belongings. If you ever set foot on this commercial complex again, I'll have you arrested for criminal trespass. I picked up my coat, adjusted my tie, and walked toward the corner office door without looking back. As the heavy glass doors closed behind me, I took a deep breath, checked my wristwatch, and smiled softly to myself. Brandon thought he had just humiliated a 54-year-old director and seized control of a $45 million commercial property portfolio. He had no idea that by firing me without cause, he had just triggered the single most catastrophic legal trap in corporate real estate history. To understand how a 38-year-old MBA graduate managed to destroy his family's corporate empire in less than 10 minutes, you have to go back 22 years to the spring of 2004. Back then, Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group was not the powerhouse multi-facility enterprise it is today. It was a modest, struggling regional logistics operator founded by George Miller, a hard-working, principled businessman who believed in keeping his word and respecting the people who built his foundation. In 2004, George identified a prime 40-acre commercial plot situated directly adjacent to Interstate 94 in North Chicago. It was the absolute holy grail of industrial logistics real estate, offering direct rail spur access, immediate highway connectivity, and zoning permissions for a 400,000 square foot retail distribution hub. Obtaining that parcel meant the difference between Miller Group remaining a small regional business or transforming into a multi-million-dollar corporate powerhouse. However, there was one massive obstacle. The City Port Authority and the private institutional land trust that owned the underlying real estate refused to execute a master ground lease with Miller Group. George's corporate entity was young, undercapitalized, and lacked an institutional credit rating. The land trust demanded a triple net master lease agreement backed by institutional collateral and a proven commercial real estate administrator willing to take on absolute personal financial liability. George called me into his cramped trailer office on the dusty construction site. I was 32 years old at the time, freshly licensed as a master property administrator with 10 years of commercial site development experience. George laid the legal blueprints across his desk and looked me in the eye. He told me that if we couldn't secure that ground lease within 14 days, the land trust would sell the purchase option to a national competitor, effectively bankrupting Miller Group's expansion strategy. I believed in George's vision, but I also understood contract law. I spent 3 straight days meeting with the trust attorneys and my own legal counsel. Together, we crafted a unique commercial structure. I established a private independent property holding entity called Vance Property Holdings, LLC. Using my family's agricultural land assets in northern Illinois as financial collateral, Vance Property Holdings executed the 30-year master ground lease directly with the institutional land trust. Once the master ground lease was secured in my private company's name, Vance Property Holdings executed a master sublease agreement back to Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group. The terms were straightforward. Miller Group paid Vance Property Holdings a token master ground rent of $1 per year plus operating expenses, while Miller Group retained exclusive occupancy rights to construct, operate, and collect revenues from the 400,000 square foot facility. However, to protect myself from ever being scapegoated or pushed out, after taking on millions of dollars in personal financial exposure, my attorney inserted a critical, highly specific legal covenant into the master ground lease agreement under Clause 14D. Clause 14D explicitly stated that the master ground sublease granted to Miller Group was strictly contingent upon my continuous active employment as the master commercial real estate director of the facility. The contract dictated that if Miller Group ever terminated my employment without cause, without a written board-certified indemnity, or through constructive dismissal, the master ground lease and all associated land easement rights would automatically revert exclusively to Vance Property Holdings LLC within 72 hours of written notice. Furthermore, upon reversion, Vance Property Holdings LLC would immediately acquire full legal ownership of all physical ground access points, loading docks, corporate parking structures, and utility easements connected to the property. For 22 years, that contract sat quietly inside a locked fireproof safe in my office. George Miller knew about Clause 14D, and he respected it completely. During those 2 decades, we worked side by side to build Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group into an $85 million annual enterprise. I personally negotiated and managed high-value long-term leases for major corporate tenants, including Midwest Freight Corporation, Great Lakes Retail Hub, and Apex Distribution Services. These 3 anchor tenants generated over $12 million a year in steady commercial rental income, anchoring the entire stability of the property. Over 22 years, I knew every square inch of that $45 million commercial hub. I knew every electrical subpanel, every rooftop HVAC unit, every stormwater runoff retention pond, and every legal easement boundary line. The tenants trusted me implicitly because I treated them fairly, maintained the facilities meticulously, and ensured that every lease agreement was executed with ironclad legal precision. Everything changed 6 months ago when George Miller suffered a severe heart condition and was forced to step down into full retirement at the age of 68. Before leaving, George transferred his majority voting shares to his son, Brandon Miller. Brandon was 38 years old, held a freshly minted executive MBA from a prestigious business school, and possessed an insatiable appetite for personal wealth, paired with absolute contempt for institutional procedure. Brandon did not view Miller Group as a legacy built on sweat and contract integrity. He viewed it as his personal piggy bank, waiting to be financialized and harvested. Within 30 days of taking the CEO seat, Brandon began replacing experienced senior department heads with his young college fraternity friends. He cut facility maintenance budgets by 40%, ignored tenant maintenance requests, and attempted to renegotiate signed commercial contracts to squeeze higher margins. I watched with growing concern as Brandon's reckless management began alienating our most loyal corporate partners. But I remained focused on my duty, continuing to manage the master lease agreements and protecting the core operating assets of the company. I assumed that Brandon's sister, Victoria Miller, a 36-year-old brilliant corporate compliance attorney who served as vice president of legal audit, would keep her brother's worst impulses in check. Unfortunately, Brandon's arrogance was far greater than anyone anticipated. He didn't just want higher corporate profits. He wanted to funnel millions of dollars directly into his private bank accounts through hidden self-dealing schemes. And when he realized that I stood squarely in the way of his illegal plan, he decided that his first executive act of total dominance would be to destroy my career. The confrontation that led to my termination had been brewing for 3 weeks. It began on a rain-slick Tuesday morning when Brandon sent his executive assistant down to the 3rd-floor facilities office to summon me up to the executive penthouse suite. When I entered his office, Brandon was sitting behind his wide mahogany desk, spinning an expensive pen in his hand while staring at 3 thick leather-bound binders. Sitting across from him was a 34-year-old corporate lawyer named Donald Vance, no relation to me, whom Brandon had recently hired as his personal legal advisor. Bypassing the company's formal legal compliance department, headed by his sister Victoria, Brandon didn't offer me a seat. He simply tapped the open binder in front of him and motioned for me to step closer. "Martin," Brandon began, his voice dripping with condescending authority, "I've spent the last month analyzing our real estate revenue structure, and frankly, it's pathetic. We have 400,000 square feet of prime industrial space in North Chicago, and we are generating a meager $12 million a year from our 3 anchor tenants. Midwest Freight, Great Lakes Retail, and Apex Distribution are paying rental rates negotiated 8 years ago. They are underpaying by at least 35% compared to current market spot rates. I looked at him calmly. Brandon, those 3 tenants signed 10-year triple net commercial leases with us 5 years ago. Under those agreements, they pay for all facility insurance, property taxes, and structural maintenance in exchange for fixed, predictable escalation caps. They paid for the $8 million concrete apron reinforcement on the Western Freight Terminal out of their own capital. They are not underpaying. They are executing a legally binding, long-term commercial contract. Brandon scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. Contracts can be modified, Martin, if you know how to apply corporate pressure. Donald and I have drafted a series of immediate operational default notices. We are citing technical maintenance non-compliance regarding storm drain clearings and dock door wear and tear. Under these notices, we give them 48 hours to either vacate the premises or sign an amended sublease agreement. He pushed a stack of papers across the desk toward me. Attached to the default notices was a commercial restructuring agreement assigning all master facility management and rental collection rights to a newly formed Delaware entity named Apex Retail Logistics, LLC. I picked up the corporate filings attached to the back of the folder and scanned the organizational structure. It took me less than 30 seconds to spot the truth. Apex Retail Logistics, LLC had been incorporated in Dover, Delaware, just 14 days prior. The listed managing member was a private holding company, owned entirely by Brandon Miller and his college roommate. Brandon was attempting to use fraudulent default claims to force our 3 largest corporate tenants out of their long-term contracts, releasing the entire 400,000 square foot complex to his private shell company at inflated rates, and diverting over $4 million a year in net rental cash flow directly into his personal offshore accounts. Brandon, I said quietly, setting the documents back down on his desk, this isn't an operational adjustment. This is blatant self-dealing and bad faith contract breach. Under Illinois compiled statute 735 ILCS 59101, issuing false technical default notices to force commercial tenant evictions without proper judicial cure periods is illegal. Furthermore, under Delaware Code Title VI, Section 18-402, using your position as CEO to transfer corporate assets to a private entity you control constitutes a direct breach of fiduciary duty. If you execute this scheme, our tenants will sue Miller Group for tens of millions of dollars in consequential damages. Brandon's face turned bright red. He slammed both hands down on the mahogany desk, standing up so fast his leather chair rolled back into the glass window. Don't you dare lecture me on law or corporate duty, Martin? Brandon roared, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. My father might have let an old, slow-moving director dictate terms around here, but George is gone. I own the voting control of this company. You are an employee. You don't get to audit my executive decisions or tell me how to handle my properties. Donald Vance, his legal advisor, cleared his throat nervously. Martin, as master property administrator, your signature is required on the technical inspection attachments to validate the default notices. If you sign them today, Brandon has authorized a $50,000 discretionary bonus for your department. I looked at Donald, then turned back to Brandon. I won't sign a single page of this fraud. Not for $50,000, and not for $5 million. My signature carries 22 years of legal integrity in this city. If you want to commit corporate fraud, you'll have to find someone else to take the fall. Brandon's eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. Is that right? You think you're indispensable, Martin? You think because you've been sitting in that office for 22 years that you own this place? I don't think I own the company. Brandon, I replied evenly. I just know what the law requires. Then you're fired, Brandon barked, his voice echoing off the glass walls of the penthouse suite. Effective right now, termination for insubordination and failure to execute executive directives. Donald, call corporate security immediately. Brandon, wait, Donald whispered, suddenly looking uneasy. We need his signature to clear the administrative filing requirements with the county land registry. We don't need a damn thing from him, Brandon shouted, cutting his lawyer off. He's an old relic whose time has run out. Martin, hand over your building access badge and your keys. Security will escort you to your office. You have 5 minutes to grab your coat and your personal photos. If you step onto this property after today, you will be escorted off in handcuffs. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't plead for my job or try to explain the severe legal consequences he was about to face. I simply looked at Brandon with a calm, knowing expression that made his jaw tighten with anger. I unclipped my master keys and my corporate identity card, laid them neatly beside his fountain pen, and turned around. 10 minutes later, under the watchful eyes of 2 young corporate security guards who looked deeply embarrassed by the entire ordeal, I packed my personal desktop clock, a few framed photos of my family, and my private leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the original legal master copy of the 2004 Master Ground Lease easement, complete with George Miller's original signature and Clause 14D clearly highlighted in yellow ink. I walked out of the glass front doors of Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group into the cool morning air. I put my briefcase in the passenger seat of my car, started the engine, and drove straight to the downtown law office of my longtime commercial land counsel, Walter Davis. Brandon thought he had just purged an old obstacle from his path. He had no idea that he had just pulled the pin on a legal grenade that was about to blow his $45 million commercial complex into complete unrecoverable pieces. 30 minutes after leaving the corporate complex, I stepped into the corner office of Walter Davis on the 28th floor of a high-rise building in downtown Chicago. Walter was 62 years old, had practiced commercial real estate law for over 35 years, and was widely regarded as one of the sharpest litigation attorneys in the Midwest. He poured 2 cups of black coffee, sat down behind his massive oak desk, and listened intently as I detailed the events of the morning. I handed him my formal termination letter, typed on Miller Group letterhead and signed personally by Brandon Miller, which explicitly stated that I had been terminated immediately, without cause, for executive insubordination. Then, I pulled the original 2004 Master Ground Lease agreement from my briefcase and placed it on the desk in front of him. Walter put on his reading glasses, turned to page 14, and spent 10 minutes reading Clause 14D. As his eyes moved across the legal covenants, a slow, broad grin spread across his face. He set the contract down, took off his glasses, and looked at me over his coffee cup. "Martin," Walter said with a rich chuckle, "I've drafted thousands of commercial property leases over 35 years, but this master ground covenant is a masterpiece. George Miller gave you absolute structural protection when you backed that original land option 22 years ago." He pointed his pen at the 3rd paragraph of Clause 14D. "Read this out loud, Martin. I want to hear it again." I picked up the document and read the highlighted text. "In the event that Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group, or any successor corporate entity thereof, terminates the employment of Master Property Administrator Martin Vance, without cause, without full board-certified indemnity, or through administrative dismissal, the master ground sublease granted herein shall immediately terminate. Full master ground possession, including all access easements, corporate parking parcels, drainage rights, and heavy commercial vehicle loading docks, shall revert exclusively to Vance Property Holdings LLC within 72 hours of written service of default notice." "Exactly," Walter said, tapping his desk with his pen. Brandon Miller thought he was firing a disposable salaried director. He didn't realize that your employment contract was the legal anchor holding Miller Group's entire physical operation to the ground. By firing you without cause to pursue his self-dealing scheme, he breached the master ground covenant. In exactly 72 hours, Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group will have zero legal right to occupy, enter, or operate on that 40-acre commercial parcel. "What is our immediate legal strategy, Walter?" I asked. "Our strategy is ironclad precision," Walter replied, standing up and walking over to his filing cabinet. "We draft a formal notice of master ground lease, reversion, and immediate commercial eviction under restatement, second of property section 15.2, and Illinois compiled statute 735, ILCS 59101. We serve it immediately via certified judicial process server upon Brandon Miller, his personal lawyer Donald Vance, and the Vice President of Corporate Compliance, Victoria Miller. Walter leaned over my chair. We give them 72 hours to cure the default by restoring the master ground lease conditions, or we execute full physical and legal possession of the entire complex at 8 o'clock sharp on Monday morning. While Walter and his associate team prepared the formal legal notice, I took out my phone and placed 3 private phone calls. I reached out directly to the chief operating officers of our 3 anchor tenants: Midwest Freight Corporation, Great Lakes Retail Hub, and Apex Distribution Services. These 3 corporate executives had worked with me for over 15 years. When I explained that Brandon Miller was attempting to issue fraudulent default notices to force them into an extortionate sublease scheme through his private shell company, they were outraged. But when I informed them that Vance Property Holdings LLC was executing its reversionary master ground lease rights, their anxiety instantly transformed into relief. I assured them that once Vance Property Holdings LLC took full legal control of the master parcel on Monday morning, I would execute direct master occupancy agreements with each of their companies under their original triple net lease rates, completely bypassing Brandon's fraudulent shell corporation and protecting their operations from any disruption. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a licensed judicial process server entered the executive offices of Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group and formally served the 72-hour reversion notice directly to Brandon Miller and his legal compliance department. In the corporate compliance department on the second floor, Victoria Miller opened the legal package, read the attached 2004 master ground lease agreement, and verified the land trust title records. Within 5 minutes, she realized the magnitude of the legal disaster her brother had created. Victoria stormed into Brandon's penthouse office holding the legal notice in her hand. "Brandon," she shouted, slamming the papers onto his desk. "What did you do? You just fired Martin Vance without board approval." Brandon looked up from his computer screen, completely unfazed, sipping an espresso. "I fired a stubborn old director who refused to follow executive orders, Victoria." "Lower your voice. It's a standard HR matter." "It is not a standard HR matter, you idiot," Victoria yelled, her voice trembling with anger. "Did you even look at the 2004 master ground title documents before you handed him a termination letter? Martin Vance doesn't just manage the property. His private company, Vance Property Holdings LLC, owns the master ground lease on the 40-acre parcel. Clause 14D states that if we fire him without cause, our master sublease is canceled in 72 hours. Brandon burst into a loud, mocking laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, please, Victoria. Stop panicking over some ancient forgotten paperwork from 20 years ago." Donald looked at the file. "Martin is an ex-employee. He's bluffing to try to extract a severance package. He has no authority to close down an $85 million company. If he tries to step foot on this land on Monday, security will throw him in jail." "Brandon, listen to me," Victoria pleaded, leaning over his desk. "This isn't a bluff. If Vance Property Holdings LLC enforces ground lease reversion, our 3 major tenants won't pay rent to us. They'll pay it to Martin. If our freight trucks can't cross his ground access easements, we are in direct breach of our $12 million logistics delivery contracts. The board will lose everything." Brandon stood up, his face hardening with stubborn arrogance. "I am the chief executive officer of this company, Victoria. My father gave me voting control, not Martin Vance, and certainly not you. That old man is out, and on Monday morning, Apex Retail Logistics LLC takes over management of this complex. Now get out of my office." Victoria stared at her brother in disbelief, realizing that his ego had completely blinded him to reality. She turned around and walked out of the penthouse suite, immediately pulling out her cell phone to call the corporate board members for an emergency intervention. Meanwhile, back in Walter Davis's office, we watched the clock tick down. The 72-hour legal notice was active. The fuse was lit, and Brandon Miller was sitting comfortably on top of $45 million worth of commercial explosives, completely unaware that Monday morning was coming faster than he could ever imagine. At 7:30 on Monday morning, the sun rose over North Chicago, casting long shadows across the 40-acre commercial complex. The 72-hour legal cure period specified in our master ground lease default notice officially expired at 7:45 a.m. I pulled into the main commercial entrance off Interstate 94 in my SUV, followed immediately by Walter Davis, two uniformed Cook County Sheriff deputies executing an expedited judicial order of land possession, a team of licensed commercial locksmiths, and a heavy flatbed truck carrying concrete security barricades. Under Walter's direct supervision, the maintenance crew placed heavy concrete barricades across the primary commercial access road leading to Miller Group's corporate headquarters and central loading bays. Prominently mounted on each barricade was a yellow, high-visibility legal notice printed in bold capital letters: Private Property. Master Ground Lease Reversion Executed by Vance Property Holdings. Cell C pursuant to Illinois Code 735, ELCS 59-101. All units are through. By 7:50 a.m., the locksmiths had rekeyed the master perimeter gates, the ground-level maintenance hubs, and the secondary distribution staging docks. At 8 o'clock sharp, the morning commercial traffic arrived. A convoy of over 30 heavy 18-wheeler freight trucks belonging to Midwest Freight Corporation and Great Lakes Retail Hub lined up along the outer access road. The Cook County Sheriff deputies stepped out onto the roadway, holding up their hands to halt the convoy, informing the fleet drivers that ground access to Miller Group's loading docks had been legally revoked by the master landowner. At 8:15 a.m., Brandon Miller arrived in his sleek black executive sports sedan. Expecting to pull into his reserved executive parking spot right outside the front glass doors, he was shocked to find his path completely blocked by concrete barricades, sheriff patrol vehicles, and a long line of idling freight trucks. Brand slammed his car into park, jumped out of the vehicle, and marched toward the barricades, his face contorted in furious disbelief. "What the hell is going on here?" Brandon screamed, waving his arms at the sheriff deputies. "Who placed these concrete blocks across my entrance?" "Officer, I am the Chief Executive Officer of Miller Commercial Retail Group. This is my property. I demand you remove these barricades immediately and arrest these trespassers." The senior Cook County Sheriff deputy stepped forward, holding a legal clipboard containing the certified ground lease title documents and the emergency possession order signed by a Cook County Chancery judge. "Sir, lower your voice," the deputy said firmly. "We are executing an official order of ground possession issued under Illinois Compiled Statutes, Chapter 735. According to municipal land records and the certified master lease easement, this 40-acre parcel is owned and controlled exclusively by Vance Property Holdings, LLC. You are currently standing on private land. If you attempt to cross these barricades or interfere with the legal possession order, you will be placed under arrest for criminal trespass." Brandon's eyes bulged with rage as he turned his head and spotted me standing next to Walter Davis near the main gatehouse. He pushed past his personal lawyer, Donald Vance, who had just rushed out of the building looking pale and terrified. "Martin," Brandon roared, pointing an aggressive finger at me over the concrete barrier. "You old snake, what kind of pathetic stunt is this? You think you can use a bunch of corrupt cops and concrete blocks to hijack my multi-million-dollar business? I'm going to sue you into bankruptcy. I'll have your license revoked by noon." Walter Davis stepped forward, adjusting his trench coat, his voice calm, resonant, and entirely unimpressed by Brandon's outburst. "Mr. Miller," Walter stated clearly so that every security guard and truck driver on the access road could hear, "my client, Martin Vance, exercised his legal rights under Clause 14D of the 2004 Master Ground Lease Agreement. When you terminated his employment without cause on Thursday, you automatically canceled Miller Group's master ground sublease. As of 7:45 this morning, your company has zero legal authority to occupy this land, operate these loading docks, or collect a single dollar of commercial revenue from this complex." Before Brandon could yell another insult, his smartphone began ringing violently in his hand. He glanced at the screen, saw the name of the Chief Operating Officer of Midwest Freight Corporation, and answered it angrily. "What is it?" Brandon snapped into the phone. Brandon, what in God's name is happening at your North Chicago facility? The CEO roared through the speaker so loudly that even the deputies could hear. 30 of our heavy freight trucks are currently blocked on the access highway. We have $2 million worth of perishable retail inventory sitting in those trailers. Your failure to provide continuous ground loading access is a direct material breach of Section 8 of our logistics agreement. If those gates aren't open within 30 minutes, Midwest Freight is terminating our $12 million contract immediately and filing a $30 million lawsuit for liquidated damages and supply chain destruction. Brandon went completely white. Before he could respond, his phone beeped with a second incoming call from the managing director of Great Lakes Retail Hub, followed immediately by an emergency alert from his chief financial officer. Brandon, Donald Vance, his young attorney, stammered, pulling Brandon's sleeve in sheer panic. I just checked the master land registry filings with the city chancery court. Walter Davis filed an emergency list pendens on the ground title at 8 a.m. sharp. The master ground lease covenant is legally valid. We can't file an injunction to stay the reversion because your termination letter explicitly admits you fired Martin without cause. If we can't clear this ground access today, Miller Group will face over $40 million in tenant default penalties by tonight. Brandon stood frozen on the asphalt, the phone slipping slightly in his hand, his arrogant composure completely shattering into total panic. For the first time in his life, he realized that his corporate title, his expensive suits, and his Ivy League degree meant absolutely nothing in the face of an ironclad commercial real estate contract. Just then, the glass front doors of the corporate headquarters opened, and Victoria Miller walked out onto the plaza, accompanied by 4 senior, gray-haired members of Miller Group's board of directors, men who had served alongside her father, George Miller, for 20 years. Victoria marched directly to the perimeter barricades, carrying a leather binder containing an emergency board decree. She looked at her trembling brother with a mix of anger and cold disdain, then turned to face me and Walter Davis. Martin, Victoria said, her voice steady and respectful. On behalf of the board of directors of Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group, I want to apologize for the gross incompetence and illegal actions of my brother. The board has just convened an emergency quorum. She turned to Brandon, holding out a document. Brandon, by unanimous vote of the board of directors, your executive authority as chief executive officer has been suspended effective immediately under Delaware Corporate Code for breach of fiduciary duty and illegal self-dealing. You no longer represent this company. Victoria turned back to me, her eyes filled with earnest determination. Martin, we need to talk. The board wants to resolve this disaster before our entire $45 million enterprise is destroyed. I looked at Victoria, nodded once and replied, I'm ready to talk, Victoria. But the negotiations happen in Walter's office and Brandon stays outside. At 11 o'clock that morning, the settlement conference convened in the main boardroom of Walter Davis's downtown law firm. Sitting on one side of the long mahogany table was Victoria Miller, accompanied by Miller Group's lead corporate attorney and 2 senior members of the board of directors. On our side of the table sat Walter Davis and myself. Outside in the building lobby downstairs, Brandon Miller sat alone on a leather couch, stripped of his executive credentials, furiously pacing as security guards prevented him from entering the legal proceedings. Victoria opened her briefcase, pulled out a formal letter signed personally by her father, George Miller, from his retirement residence in Arizona, and placed it gently on the table. Martin, Victoria began, her voice soft and genuine. Before we discuss financial terms, my father asked me to read this note to you. He wants you to know that he is deeply ashamed of Brandon's actions. He built this company on trust and contract integrity with you 22 years ago, and he fully supports your right to enforce Clause 14D. The board recognizes that Brandon acted illegally, and we are prepared to accept whatever terms are necessary to save the company and protect our tenants. Walter Davis nodded approvingly, sliding a 5-page formal settlement and master lease buyout agreement across the polished table. Victoria, Walter said firmly, Here are the non-negotiable terms set by Vance Property Holdings LLC to resolve the master ground default and restore complete commercial access to the complex. Walter outlined the four core conditions of the agreement. First, Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group would execute an immediate, irrevocable buyout of Vance Property Holdings LLC's master ground lease rights for a lump sum cash payment of $14,500,000, wired directly into my company's corporate account within 24 hours. Second, Brandon Miller would be permanently removed from all executive roles, stripped of his CEO title, and forced to surrender his voting control back to a board-administered family trust managed exclusively by Victoria Miller. Furthermore, Brandon's private shell company, Apex Retail Logistics LLC, would be dissolved immediately, with all corporate documentation turned over to internal auditors. Third, Miller Group would issue a formal public board resolution retracting the false termination letter issued against me, restoring my professional record with full honors, and recognizing 22 years of distinguished service. Fourth, Vance Property Holdings LLC would immediately execute direct, long-term master ground access guarantees for Midwest Freight Corporation, Great Lakes Retail Hub, and Apex Distribution Services, ensuring that all three anchor tenants retain their original triple anchor tenants, their original triple net lease rates, without any interference or rate hikes for the remainder of their 10-year terms. Victoria reviewed the financial terms with her board members. The $14.5 million buyout was a significant sum, but compared to the catastrophic $40 million loss the company faced from tenant default litigation and total facility shutdown, it was an obvious, life-saving bargain for Miller Group. "We accept all terms," Victoria stated without hesitation. "Our corporate treasury will process the $14,500,000 wire transfer immediately." She picked up a pen and signed the settlement document on behalf of Miller Group's board of directors. I picked up my pen and signed directly alongside her, bringing a definitive legal end to the dispute. By 2:15 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, the full $14,500,000 wire transfer cleared into the bank account of Vance Property Holdings LLC. As promised, Walter Davis immediately filed a formal cancellation of the ground lease default notice with the Cook County Chancery Court, clearing the lis pendens title encumbrance. Within 30 minutes, the concrete barricades were removed from the North Chicago access road. The Cook County Sheriff deputies stepped down, and the long convoy of heavy freight trucks rolled smoothly into the loading bays, resuming full logistics operations without losing a single dollar of long-term tenant revenue. Over the next 2 weeks, the corporate cleanup was swift and total. Brandon Miller was formally ousted from the company. The board stripped him of his executive salary, forced him to reimburse Miller Group for $450,000 in misappropriated corporate funds, and barred him from entering any company facility. His young advisor, Donald Vance, was fired for legal negligence and reported to the state's Bar Association for facilitating self-dealing contracts. Victoria Miller officially assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer of Miller Commercial Retail and Logistics Group. Under her ethical leadership, the company stabilized its operations, restored full maintenance funding to the North Chicago commercial complex, and strengthened its corporate relationship with all three major anchor tenants. As for me, I officially retired from commercial real estate management at the age of 54. With $14,500,000 safely secured in my private investment trust, I bought a peaceful 50-acre waterfront farm in northern Illinois, far away from the corporate boardrooms, glass penthouses, and stressful lease negotiations. Looking back at the whole ordeal, I don't feel anger toward Brandon Miller. I feel a quiet, profound satisfaction. He was a young man who believed that arrogance, titles, and greedy shortcuts could replace decades of hard work, loyalty, and ironclad contract law. He thought he was kicking an old director out onto the street. Instead, he learned a $14.5 million lesson about the power of foresight and the unyielding weight of legal integrity. In commercial real estate, as in life, people often forget that a building is only as strong as the foundation it sits upon. And if you don't respect the man who laid the ground beneath your feet, Don't be surprised when the entire structure comes crashing down around you.